Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 334 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the mystery of Pontius Pilate. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
The four Gospels record that the Roman governor who sent Jesus to his death was Pontius Pilate. In some circles, Pilate is portrayed as a consummate villain who was punished by God. But in other circles, he's considered a literal Christian saint and martyr. What do we really know about Pontius Pilate? Who was he? And what eventually happened to him? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, why did you want to do this mystery?
The idea for it came to me after I was asked to do an interview on Pontius Pilate by the guys over at the Catholic Talk Show, and we'll have links to where you can check out their podcast. They sent me a question list before the interview, and they had a bunch of really detailed questions about Pilate. So, like before any interview, I did some reading to refresh my memory so that I'd have the needed facts at the top of my cerebrum, and I thought, I shouldn't let all this research go to waste. There are a bunch of interesting mysteries connected with Pilate, and this would make a good episode of Mysterious World, so that's why we're doing it.
And where do you want to start?
By looking at what led to Pilate being appointed governor of Judea. First, we'll look at the overall situation that led to having a Roman official in charge, and then we'll look at Pilate himself and what led to him being appointed governor. Afterwards, we'll look at what he did while he was governor, including his role in the crucifixion of Jesus, and then we'll look at what happened to Pilate after the crucifixion.
Then let's start with the overall situation that led to Judea having a Roman governor. How did that come about?
For reasons that we won't go into in this episode, the Romans assumed political control of Judea in 63 BC, and in 39 BC, they appointed Herod the Great as king of Judea. We read about Herod the Great in Matthew 2 and Luke 1 because it was during his reign that Jesus was born, and it was Herod the Great who slaughtered the baby boys 2 years old and under in Bethlehem in an attempt to kill Jesus, which caused the Holy Family to flee to Egypt. Herod then died in 1 BC. Now, you'll hear a lot of people say he died in 4 BC, but better, more recent scholarship points to him dying in 1 BC, and we'll have links to where you can get good books on that scholarship. Him dying means someone needed to take over for him. Herod had a bunch of sons, but he'd been killing off a lot of them one by one, thinking that they were conspiring against him. For example, Herod's firstborn son, Antipater, was for many years favored by Herod as his heir to his throne, but he too was eventually brought up on charges of plotting against his father, and he was executed just 5 days before Herod's own death. In view of such executions, the Emperor Augustus reportedly, but probably apocryphally, quipped, "It is better to be Herod's pig than son." The joke being that since Herod was Jewish, he didn't eat pork, so at least his pig would be safe, whereas his sons weren't. 3 of Herod's sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, ended up inheriting significant portions of his kingdom. Until shortly before his death, Herod's will named Antipas as his principal successor, but in the end, he reportedly changed his will in favor of Archelaus. This set up a dispute among family members, with some favoring Archelaus, others favoring Antipas, and still others favoring the idea of direct Roman rule over Palestine. The matter was ultimately settled by the Emperor Augustus when the 3 brothers traveled to him for his decision. This trip forms part of the background of Jesus' parable of the talents, in which a nobleman went on a far journey to receive kingly power and then return, in Luke 19. Ultimately, Augustus confirmed Archelaus as Herod's principal successor. The territories of Judea, Samaria, and the family homeland of Idumea, which was where the Herods were from, thus went to Archelaus. The territories of Galilee and Perea went to Antipas, and the northeasterly part of Herod's kingdom, Iturea and Trachonitis, went to Philip. Collectively, these brothers, like other members of the family, are known as Herodians. Each of them also was called by the name Herod: Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip, and each is mentioned in the New Testament, though since the kingdom was now split up, none of them officially received the title king. We meet Herod Archelaus only briefly when the Holy Family is returning from their flight to Egypt, and St. Matthew writes,
"When Herod the Great died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' And he rose and took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus reigned over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and dwelt in a city called Nazareth."
Had it not been for Archelaus obtaining Judea, Joseph might have taken the Holy Family back to Bethlehem, at least for a time. But he was aware of the bad reputation that Archelaus had, so he was afraid to go back to Bethlehem, which was in Archelaus's territory. Instead, Joseph received another dream telling him to go to Galilee. Galilee was ruled by Antipas, a less dangerous ruler than Archelaus. And Archelaus had a really poor reputation as a ruler. Even before Augustus had confirmed him in his position, Archelaus had 3,000 of his subjects massacred in the temple at Passover. He also canceled that year's Passover, which would be a really shocking event for a Jewish ruler to do. Passover was one of the three main Jewish festivals. It was one of the three feasts that Jews from all over the country were supposed to come to Jerusalem to attend, and Jews came from other nations too. So Archelaus had a city full of pilgrims when he killed 3,000 of them and then canceled the holiday altogether and sent everybody home. Archelaus made many enemies among his subjects, and in AD 6, the Romans banished him to what is now France and assumed direct rule of his territory. That is why, when Jesus was crucified, a Roman governor is in charge of Judea rather than one of the Herodians. And it's important to realize that the governors were not based in Jerusalem. Instead, they were based in a city called Caesarea Maritima, which was the capital of Roman Judea. There are a number of cities in the ancient world called Caesarea after the Caesars, but this one was a maritime city on the northern coast of modern Israel, so it's called Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea on the sea. That was where the governors were based, but they would travel to other locations in Judea, including Jerusalem, where they would make a big point of being there for the big festivals like Passover, because observant Jews were supposed to be there for the event, and if you're an occupying power, you want to show the colors and let your subjects know you're in charge. You also want to be there in case any overly excitable Jews start a riot or a rebellion, and you want to keep your own troops in the city from antagonizing the Jews into starting a riot or rebellion. In any event, the first governor was a guy named Coponius, who ruled from AD 6 to 9, or 3 years. The second was Marcus Ambivulus, who ruled from 9 to 12. The third was Annius Rufus, who reigned from 12 to 15. And the fourth was Valerius Gratus, who began reigning in 15, but there's a question about when he left office. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, he left office in AD 26, which would give him an 11-year term, far longer than any of the governors who had preceded him. They had only reigned for 3 years each, so Gratus reigned longer than all three of his predecessors combined. Here's how Josephus describes his tenure.
Tiberius was now the third emperor, and he sent Valerius Gratus to be procurator of Judea and to succeed Annius Rufus. This man deprived Ananus of the high priesthood and appointed Ismael, the son of Phabi, to be high priest. He also deprived him in a little time and ordained Eleazar, the son of Ananus, who had been high priest before, to be high priest, which office, when he had held it for a year, Gratus deprived him of it, and gave the high priesthood to Simon the son of Camathus. And when he had possessed that dignity no longer than a year, Joseph Caiaphas was made his successor. When Gratus had done those things, he went back to Rome, after he had tarried in Judea 11 years, when Pontius Pilate came as his successor.
So, at least according to Josephus, the major feature of Gratus's tenure was his frequent changing of the Jewish high priest. Traditionally, in the Old Testament, the high priesthood was a for-life office, and one high priest would need to die before another was put into office. But that changed in the centuries before Christ, and whoever was ruler appointed the high priests. Gratus had 5 high priests in his 11-year reign. Annas, who was there when he came into office, and this is the same Annas who we read about in the Gospels. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of the crucifixion. After Annas, Gratus appointed Ismail, Eleazar, Simon, and then Caiaphas in sequence. And it would be Caiaphas who was high priest when the crucifixion happened. But that would be during the tenure of Gratus's successor, Pontius Pilate.
Then let's talk about Pontius Pilate. First of all, what sources of information do we have about him?
Well, there are the 4 Gospels. Our next most prominent source is Josephus, who mentions Pilate both in Jewish War and his Antiquities of the Jews. Those are 2 of Josephus's works. The Egyptian Jewish author Philo of Alexandria has a passage discussing Pilate, and he's mentioned briefly by the Roman historian Tacitus. We've also found a stone inscription from his own day about him and some coins that he minted. Those are our major sources, but he's also mentioned in later Christian literature, as we'll cover.
So let's tackle the issue of how he became the Roman governor of Judea. What do we know about that?
Well, we know more about Pilate than any other Roman governor of Judea, principally because of the interest Christians took in him, but we still know a lot less than you might think. We do not know anything specific about his time before he became governor, though we can infer some things based on what we do know. For example, we can learn a little bit about him from his name, Pontius Pilate. In ancient Rome in this period, people typically had 3 names. Their first one was their nomen, which tells you what family they were from. It was the equivalent of our last names. The second was their praenomen, which was given to them as an individual at birth. That's the equivalent of our first name. And the third name was their cognomen, or cognomen, if you want to pronounce it fancy, which was basically a nickname that they were given later in life. In Pilate's case, Pontius is his family name. It's a Samnite name, which means he was of Samnite origin. The Samnites were a people that lived further south in Italy than Rome itself. And one of the things we know about Samnites is that they were originally a plebeian family rather than a patrician one. Plebs were the lower class, patricians were the upper class. We know that they were plebs because another member of the family, Pontius Aquila, had been one of the tribunes of the plebs. However, Pontius Pilate himself was of a higher status and was a member of the equestrian order. You'll sometimes see that term, equite was the Latin term, but it'll sometimes be translated as knight with a K, K-N-I-G-H-T, like the guys who ride on horses. That's why they're called equestrians in English. That meant in Rome that he had money. Not as much money as a member of the senatorian class, but more than an ordinary Roman. So that's what his nomen, or family name, Pontius, tells us. Unfortunately, we don't know what Pilate's praenomen, or individual birth name, was. This hadn't been preserved in our sources because the praenomen was losing its importance at this time. In the empire, there were only about 18 male birth names that were in use at the time, and only 12 of them were common. So in any given family, there would be lots of men with the same family name and the same birth name. You know, it's like lots of John Joneses and so forth. As a result, attention tended to focus on the cognomen when you wanted to talk about an individual. And that is what Pilate, or Pilatus in Latin, was. It was a nickname he got later in life. We're not certain what it means, and I've seen two proposals. One is that it meant armed or skilled with a javelin, based on the word pilum, which meant javelin. The other is that it meant wearing the pileus, where the pileus was a cap or badge that was worn by a manumitted slave, someone who had been released from slavery. Between those two, my guess is that skilled with a javelin is more likely because Pilate wasn't a manumitted slave. He was an equestrian, a knight. So it would be ironic, although not impossible, for him to get a nickname that ironically but falsely suggested he was a freed slave. Whereas it would be more natural for him to get a nickname suggesting that he was skilled with a javelin. This is because he got appointed governor, and it was normal for governors of the equestrian rank to have military experience, so he could have had training with a javelin. In Rome, they had a system called the cursus honorum, or course of honors, which was a set of achievements that you were supposed to meet as you rose in society. And if you were an equestrian, you needed to do military service before you became a governor. So skilled with a javelin would be more probable to my mind.
Do we know anything about how Pilate became governor?
Well, people were appointed governors by the emperor, and the emperor at the time was Tiberius, so responsibility for his appointment ultimately lay with Tiberius. However, in AD 26, the year Pilate was appointed, Tiberius basically withdrew from Rome and went to live on the island of Capri. He stayed on Capri for years, and there were lots of rumors about what he was doing there, including things involving children. But he wasn't taking an active role as emperor because, unlike modern political leaders, if you were emperor, you actually had to show up to conduct state business. You couldn't do very much from a private retreat. Well, while he was on Capri, Tiberius left the administration of Rome in the hands of a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus, who was the head of the Praetorian Guard. And even before he went to Capri, Tiberius had been relying on Sejanus for a lot of things. So there's a lot of speculation that Pilate really owed his appointment as governor to Sejanus. You'll even see some authors just asserting that Sejanus was Pilate's benefactor, but the ancient sources don't say that. So that's speculative, and we don't know that for sure. Incidentally, if you want to see a really interesting portrayal of Sejanus, watch the 1976 BBC TV miniseries I, Claudius, based on the books by Robert Graves. It's extremely well done, although not for the faint of heart. And in several episodes, Sejanus is played by Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard himself. Only in this miniseries, Patrick Stewart has hair. I don't know if it's real or a wig, but if you've ever wanted to see Captain Picard with hair, this is your chance. And keep Sejanus in mind because he's going to come back into our mystery.
What happened with Pilate once he became governor?
Here's where our Jewish sources help us out. Josephus relates 4 incidents that happened during Pilate's tenure, and Philo relates 1. Josephus also tells us that Joseph Caiaphas, who was high priest when Pilate came into office, was still high priest right up to the end of his tenure. So Pilate had 1 high priest for all the years of his governorship, in contrast to his predecessor, Gratus, who frequently changed them. This signifies one of 2 things. Either Pilate was forbidden to change high priests the way Gratus had, though we have no statement saying that that was the case, or Pilate had a good working relationship with Caiaphas, or at least a decent one, and didn't want to inflame Jewish sensibilities by changing the high priest when he had a functional relationship with him. Now, here's the first of the incidents from Pilate's tenure that Josephus relates. We don't know the year, but it apparently happened early in his governorship.
Now Pilate, the procurator of Judea, removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take their winter quarters there, in order to abolish the Jewish laws. So he introduced Caesar's effigies, which were upon the ensigns, and brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns and had not those ornaments. Pilate was the first who brought those images to Jerusalem and set them up there, which was done without the knowledge of the people, because it was done in the nighttime. But as soon as they knew it, they came in multitudes to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate many days that he would remove the images. And when he would not grant their requests, because it would tend to the injury of Caesar, while yet they persevered in their request, on the 6th day he ordered his soldiers to have their weapons privately, while he came and sat upon his judgment seat, which seat was so prepared in the open place of the city, that it concealed the army that lay ready to oppress them. And when the Jews petitioned him again, he gave a signal to the soldiers to encompass them round, and threatened that their punishment should be no less than immediate death, unless they would leave off disturbing him and go their ways home. But they threw themselves upon the ground, and laid their necks bare, and said they would take their death very willingly, rather than the wisdom of their laws should be transgressed. Upon which Pilate was deeply affected with their firm resolution to keep their laws inviolable, and presently commanded the images to be carried back from Jerusalem to Caesarea.
The ensigns that Josephus refers to were the military standards that the Roman army carried with them. They were basically tall poles that had symbols on them that you could so that you could identify the military unit. And they also served for a rallying point for the troops. This is kind of like more recent armies carrying flags with them into battle. As far as I know, modern armies use flags for ceremonial purposes, but don't actually carry them into battle. But as recently as the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces would bring flags with them to battles as part of their friend or foe and troop rallying systems. Well, previous governors had shown deference to Jewish sensibilities about bringing images into Jerusalem. Because of the prohibition on idols, Jews of this period could look on any image as idolatrous, and since Jerusalem was a holy city, you weren't supposed to bring images there. And Pilate knew that because he had the standards with the images of the emperor, who would have been Tiberius, brought into the city at night. So he was being deliberately provocative towards Jewish sensibilities. In his alternative account of this incident in the Jewish War, Josephus says that a vast number of people went up to Caesarea to petition Pilate, and he says that during the first 5 days, they fell down prostrate on the ground and continued immovable from that posture for 5 days and as many nights. Prostrate in this case meaning bending down with their face to the ground. So they were like kneeling on the ground and put their face towards the ground. He also says that on the 6th day, Pilate's soldiers surrounded them in 3 ranks, and that Pilate had them unsheath their swords so that the people would see that the threat of death was real. It was at this point that they threw themselves on the ground on their backs so that their throats would be exposed and the soldiers could kill them more easily. And I love the boldness of this move. Just kill us all now if you're not going to take those images away. Well, Pilate was impressed by this move too, and he did remove the images. Part of that could be because he didn't want other Jews to complain about him for murdering their countrymen in cold blood after he did something that previous governors had refused to do. But what this shows us is that Pilate was not completely inflexible. Sufficient Jewish resistance could get him to change his mind about things.
You said that Josephus mentioned 4 incidents involving Pilate, and we've covered the first. What was the second?
Pilate wanted to build an aqueduct to bring more water into Jerusalem, but to pay for it, he wanted to use money that was korban, that had been donated to the temple treasury, so it was sacred. Well, this plan did not go down well with the Jews, and Josephus describes it like this.
But Pilate undertook to bring a current of water to Jerusalem, and did it with the sacred money, and derived the origin of the stream from the distance of 200 furlongs, that is, from 40 miles away. However, the Jews were not pleased with what had been done about this water, and many 10,000s of the people got together and made a clamor against him, and insisted that he should leave off that design. Some of them also used reproaches and abused the man, as crowds of such people usually do. So he habited a great number of his soldiers in their habit, that is, in civilian clothes, who carried daggers under their garments, and sent them to a place where they might surround them. So he bade the Jews himself go away, but they, boldly casting reproaches upon him, he gave the soldiers that signal which had been beforehand agreed on, who laid upon them much greater blows than Pilate had commanded them, and equally punished those that were tumultuous and those that were not. Nor did they spare them in the least. And since the people were unarmed and were caught by men prepared for what they were about, there were a great number of them slain by these means, and others of them ran away wounded, and thus an end was put to this sedition.
In the parallel account in Jewish War, Josephus says that this event happened while Pilate himself was in Jerusalem, not Caesarea. He says that the soldiers were wearing their armor under their street clothes and that he told them to leave their swords at home since swords would be too obvious. And instead of mentioning the daggers, he says the soldiers beat people with clubs. He also says,
large numbers of the Jews perished, some from the blows which they received, others trodden to death by their companies in the ensuing flight. Cowed by the fate of the victims, the multitude was reduced to silence.
So this time Pilate did not back down, though Josephus does say in Antiquities of the Jews that the soldiers beat them more severely than Pilate had intended.
At this point in the story, I know you want to take a detour. What did you want to tell us about?
About what was happening back in Rome. You'll recall that Tiberius had left the administration of Rome up to Sejanus while he was sequestered on Capri. Well, Sejanus had begun to conduct treason trials for various senators and equestrians. He also had several members of the imperial family exiled, and all of them died under suspicious circumstances. At the same time, he was ingratiating himself to the Julian family, and evidence emerged that he, together with his lover Tiberius's niece Livilla, were plotting to overthrow Tiberius with the help of the Julian family and assume control of the state, either with Sejanus as emperor or as the regent for the next emperor. He was already, for practical purposes, the most powerful man in the empire, but he wanted more. However, out on Capri, Tiberius got wind of this in AD 31, and he was afraid to move against Sejanus suddenly because that might prompt Sejanus to launch the planned coup. So instead, he started a campaign to undermine Sejanus by sending letters to Rome that took contradictory attitudes towards him, sometimes praising him, sometimes criticizing him. And these had the effect of weakening Sejanus's popularity. The Roman historian Dio Cassius explains,
in view of all this, people began to hold Sejanus more and more in contempt. In fact, they even avoided meeting him or being left alone with him, and that in a manner too marked not to be noticed. When therefore Tiberius learned of this, he took courage, believing that he should have the populace and the Senate on his side, and attacked him. And first, in order to take him off his guard as completely as possible, he spread the report that he was going to give him the tribunician power. That is, that he would appoint Sejanus as a tribune. Then he sent a communication against him to the Senate by the hands of Naevius Sertorius Macro, whom he had already secretly appointed to command the bodyguards and had instructed in regard to all that required to be done. Macro entered Rome by night, as if on some different errand, and communicated his instructions to Memmius Regulus, then consul, and to Gracinius Laco, commander of the night watch. At dawn, Macro ascended the Palatine Hill, for the Senate was to sit in the temple of Apollo, and encountering Sejanus, who had not yet gone in, and perceiving that he was troubled because Tiberius had sent him no message, he encouraged him, telling him aside and in confidence that he was bringing him the tribunician power. Overjoyed at this announcement, Sejanus rushed into the Senate chamber. Macro now sent back to their camp the praetorians that were guarding Sejanus in the Senate, after revealing to them his authority and declaring that he bore a letter from Tiberius which bestowed rewards upon them. Then, after stationing the night watch about the temple in their place, he went in, delivered the letter to the consuls, and came out again before a word was read. He then instructed Laco to keep guard there, and himself hurried away to the camp to prevent any uprising. In the meantime, the letter was read. It was a long one, and contained no wholesale denunciation of Sejanus, but first some other matter, then a slight censure of his conduct, then something else, and after that some further objection to him. And at the close it said that 2 senators who were among his intimate associates must be punished, and that he himself must be kept under guard. For Tiberius refrained from giving orders outright to put him to death, not because he did not wish to give such orders, but because he feared that some disturbance might result from such a course. At any rate, he pretended that he could not with safety even make the journey to Rome, and therefore summoned one of the consuls to him. Now the letter disclosed no more than this, but one could observe both by sight and hearing many and various effects produced by it. At first, before it was read, they had been lauding Sejanus, thinking that he was about to receive the tribunician power, and had kept cheering him, anticipating the honors for which they had hoped, and making it clear to him that they would concur in bestowing them. When, however, nothing of the sort appeared, but they heard again and again just the reverse of what they had expected, they were at first perplexed, and then thrown into deep dejection. Some of those seated near him actually rose up and left him, for now they no longer cared to share the same seat with the man whom previously they had prized having as their friend. Then praetors and tribunes surrounded him to prevent his causing any disturbance by rushing out, as he certainly would have done if he had been startled at the outset by hearing any general denunciation. As it was, he paid no great heed to the successive charges as they were read, thinking each one a slight matter which stood alone, and hoping that, at best, no further charge, or in any event none that could not be disposed of, was contained in the letter. So he let the time slip by and remained in his seat. Meanwhile, Regulus summoned him to go forward, but he paid no heed, not out of contempt, for he had already been humbled, but because he was unaccustomed to having orders addressed to him. But when the consul, raising his voice, and also pointing at him, called the second and third time, "Sejanus, come here," he merely asked him, "Me? Are you calling me?" At last, however, he stood up, and Laco, who had now returned, took his seat beside him. When finally the reading of the letter was finished, all with one voice denounced and threatened him, some because they had been wronged, others through fear, some to conceal their friendship for him, and still others out of joy at his downfall. Regulus did not put the vote to all the senators, nor propose to any the death penalty, fearing opposition from some quarter and a disturbance in consequence, for Sejanus had numerous relatives and friends. He merely asked a single senator if he should not be imprisoned, and when he got an affirmative answer, he led Sejanus out of the Senate, and together with the other magistrates and Laco, took him down to the prison.
So Tiberius tricked Sejanus into going into the Senate, thinking that he was going to be given greater powers, only to have him slowly and carefully denounced so that everyone abandoned him and he was taken into custody. He wasn't in prison for long, however. Wikipedia summarizes,
That same evening, the Senate convened at the Temple of Concord and summarily condemned Sejanus to death. He was taken from prison and strangled, after which his body was cast onto the Gemonian stairs. Riots ensued, in which mobs hunted down and killed anyone they could link to Sejanus. Following the issue of damnatio memoriae, that is, condemnation of memory, by the Senate, Sejanus' statues were torn down and his name obliterated from all public records, even from coins. Tiberius soon ordered more killings. Livilla committed suicide, or was starved to death by her mother Antonia Minor. Although Rome at first rejoiced at the demise of Sejanus, the city was quickly plunged into more extensive trials, as Tiberius persecuted all those who could in any way be tied to the schemes of Sejanus or had courted his friendship. The senatorial ranks were purged. The hardest hit were those families with political ties to the Julians. Even the imperial magistracy was not exempted from Tiberius's wrath. Arrests and executions were now supervised by Naevius Sutorius Macro, who succeeded Sejanus as the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. The political turmoil continued until the death of Tiberius in AD 37.
And so Sejanus passed on to his reward. But because Pilate may have been linked to Sejanus, this may play a larger role in our story.
That's something that comes up in the incident that you mentioned Philo of Alexandria recording. What did he have to say?
Well, Tiberius's successor, Gaius Caligula, started out as a good emperor, but then he went mad. He started demanding to be worshipped as a god, even in Rome itself and during his lifetime, which was unusual for emperors. He went as far in this that he demanded that a statue of him be placed in the temple in Jerusalem, which prompted an enormous crisis with the Jews, and which would have led to war if Caligula hadn't been such a rotten emperor that his own Praetorian Guard killed him in AD 41. Before that, however, one of the efforts to get him to change his mind was an embassy or delegation of Jewish leaders who went to meet him, and Philo of Alexandria was part of that delegation. He also wrote an account of the event known as the Embassy to Gaius. In it, he encourages Caligula to follow the example of Tiberius, who always respected Jewish religious sensibilities, and it's in this context that he relates an incident involving Pontius Pilate.
One of Tiberius's lieutenants was Pilate, who was appointed to govern Judea. He, not so much to honor Tiberius as to annoy the multitude, dedicated in Herod's palace in the holy city some shields coated with gold. They had no image work traced on them, nor anything else forbidden by the law apart from the barest inscription stating two facts: the name of the person who made the dedication, that is, Pilate himself, and of him in whose honor it was made, that is, Tiberius. But when the multitude understood the matter, which had by now become a subject of common talk, having put at their head King Herod's 4 sons, who in dignity and good fortune were not inferior to a king, and his other descendants and the persons of authority in their own body, they appealed to Pilate to redress the infringement of their traditions caused by the shields, and not to disturb the customs which throughout all the preceding ages had been safeguarded without disturbance by kings and by emperors. When Pilate, naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness, stubbornly refused, they clamored, "Do not arouse sedition. Do not make war. Do not destroy the peace. You do not honor the emperor by dishonoring ancient laws. Do not take Tiberius as your pretext for outraging the nation. He does not wish any of our customs to be overthrown. If you say that he does, produce yourself an order or a letter or something of the kind, so that we may cease to pester you, and having chosen our envoys may petition our Lord." It was this final point which particularly exasperated him, for he feared that if they actually sent an embassy, they would also expose the rest of his conduct as governor by stating in full the briberies, the insults, the robberies, the outrages and wanton injuries, the executions without trial constantly repeated, the ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. So with all his vindictiveness and furious temper, he was in a difficult position. He had not the courage to take down what had been dedicated, nor did he wish to do anything which would please his subjects. At the same time, he knew full well the constant policy of Tiberius in these matters. The magnates saw this, and understanding that he had repented of his action but did not wish to appear penitent, sent letters of very earnest supplication to Tiberius. When he had read them through, what language he used about Pilate, what threats he made, the violence of his anger, Though he was not easily roused to anger, it is needless to describe since the facts speak for themselves. For at once, without even postponing it to the morrow, he wrote to Pilate with a host of reproaches and rebukes for his audacious violation of precedent, and bade him at once take down the shields and have them transferred from the capital to Caesarea on the coast, to be set up in the temple of Augustus. And so they were. So both objects were safeguarded, the honor paid to the emperor, and the policy observed from of old in dealing with the city.
Now, Philo and his embassy were desperate to avoid Caligula's statue being put in the temple, so he's undoubtedly painting Tiberius in the best possible light and Pilate in the worst possible light. We just need to be a little cautious in how we interpret this. Philo says that Pilate put up the golden shields on Herod's palace not so much to honor Tiberius, but to annoy his subjects. Yet even this statement concedes he did it to honor Tiberius. Now, let's suppose for a moment that Pilate had been appointed by Sejanus, that Sejanus was his patron. And back in Rome, Tiberius is cleaning house of anyone allied with Sejanus. So what's Pilate going to think? He's going to think, I may feel Tiberius's wrath as well. So what better thing to do than publicly honor Tiberius in his own territory by putting up golden shields that Pilate had made in his honor? That should get him in good with the boss. Only when the Jews write a letter to Tiberius and explain what he's done, it blows up in his face, and Tiberius orders him to move the shields out of Jerusalem and put them in the temple of Augustus in Caesarea Maritima. Of course, we don't know that Sejanus was Pilate's benefactor. We don't know that this is what was intended, but it's still an interesting possibility.
Now, let's turn to the final two incidents about Pilate that Josephus records. What was the third of the four?
Well, here we come to the passage that's known as the Testimonium Flavianum, or the Testimony of Flavius Josephus. Immediately after relating the first two unfortunate incidents involving Pilate, our surviving manuscripts of the work say this.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day.
So this is Josephus's principal mention of Jesus. Unfortunately, scholars agree that the text as we have it is not as Joseph originally wrote it. It's been edited by a Christian to make it more pro-Christian than what Josephus would have said. On account of that, a lot of Jesus mythicists dismiss the passage entirely, but more serious scholars, including unbelievers like Bart Ehrman, acknowledge that Josephus did write a version of this passage. It's just been jazzed up a bit by a Christian editor. Also, there's another passage where Josephus mentions Jesus when he talks about the martyrdom of Jesus' so-called brother James, and he introduces this James by saying he's the brother of Jesus who is called Christ. And there's no doubt about that passage.
Do scholars have any idea what the main passage, as originally written by Josephus, actually said?
They do, and it's really just a matter of snipping out the most pro-Christian statements, the ones that would make Josephus himself a Christian, and the rest of the passage pretty much hangs together. For example, here's a version proposed by the British scholar James Dunn.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, condemned him to the cross. Those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day.
This is basically the same, except that it omits, if it be lawful to call him a man, after saying that he was a wise man. It also omits, he was the Christ, and it omits the statements, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. Without these heavily pro-Christian statements, though, the passage basically hangs together. Still, this is a scholarly reconstruction, and I find another possibility intriguing. In 1971, the Israeli scholar Shlomo Pines published an Arabic version of the passage that he had discovered, and with the exception of one ambiguous statement at the end, it doesn't have the obviously pro-Christian elements. The Arabic version reads this way.
In those days, there was a wise man named Jesus. He lived a good life, distinguishing himself by his learning, and many people, as many Jews as of other nations, became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to crucifixion and death, but those who had become his disciples did not cease to be so, and affirmed that he had appeared to them 3 days after the crucifixion, and that he was alive. Perhaps he was the Messiah of whom the prophets speak.
Except for the bit at the end that perhaps he was the Messiah, it doesn't contain anything obviously pro-Christian, and even that's ambiguous. It doesn't commit Josephus to being a believer in Christ. He's just saying perhaps. So some scholars have proposed that this Arabic version may be the original, which I find an interesting possibility.
Before we leave the subject of Jesus' execution by Pilate, is there anything you want to say about the governor based on the 4 Gospels?
Well, the Gospels are one of our principal sources about Pilate, but he appears in them almost exclusively in the course of the Passion narrative. These accounts are all focused on the same set of events. They do give us additional insight about him and principally reveal him as an ambiguous man. Now, I don't want to turn this episode into a lengthy commentary on the Passion narrative, so I don't want to go through them in detail, but I will mention a few things briefly. There is another incident regarding Pilate before Jesus' passion that's mentioned in Luke 13, where we read,
There were some present at that very time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No. I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish.
So apparently Pilate had killed some Galileans while they were sacrificing in the Jerusalem temple. We don't know anything else about this incident, like why Pilate did it, but I have seen it suggested that it may shed some light on an event that occurs later in Luke's Passion narrative, where the Jewish authorities accuse Jesus of stirring up people from Galilee to Jerusalem, and we read,
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this, they had been at enmity with each other.
The thing is, we don't know anything about the previous hostility that Herod Agrippa had with Pilate. It's not mentioned in our other sources, but I've seen it proposed that at least part of the hostility may have been due to Pilate executing the Galileans while they were sacrificing in the temple, because Galileans were normally subject to Herod, not Pilate. So maybe Herod thought Pilate was encroaching on his turf by judging his subjects. In fact, you could even propose that this was Pilate's way of making it up to Herod by consciously returning one of Herod's subjects to him for judgment rather than just judging him himself. I think that's an interesting possibility, but I don't think it's certain because there are other reasons that they could have been hostile towards each other, like Herod resenting Pilate as an interloper on what he saw as his family's rightful territory, and Pilate resenting Herod because of Herod's own resentment and because he wasn't a super fan of Jews to begin with. However that may be, here Pilate respected Herod's authority and jurisdiction by returning Jesus to him, which also gave Herod the chance to see Jesus, something he'd wanted for a long time. And so Herod and Pilate became friends.
Was there anything else from the Passion narratives that you wanted to comment on today?
Just one small thing. In Matthew's version of the Passion, we read,
While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream.
Now, in reality, we don't know anything about what this dream occurred. We don't even know the name of Pilate's wife. It's not in our historical sources, though you will hear her described in later literature as Claudia Procula. However, I'm aware of a fascinating dramatization of what the dream could have been. In 1941, so during World War II, English author Dorothy Sayers wrote a series of 12 radio plays about Jesus. They were called The Man Born to be King, and they were broadcast on BBC Radio. In the 11th play, titled King of Sorrows, Pilate and his wife have a conversation about what her dream was.
Pilate! My Lord Pilate! Oh, Pilate, my husband.
What is it, Claudia? Claudia, tell me, what's the matter?
I've had a dream of such terror.
Tell me your dream.
I was in a ship at sea, voyaging among the islands of the Aegean. At first the weather seemed calm and sunny, but presently the sky darkened, and the sea began to toss with the wind. And then, out of the east, there came a cry, strange and piercing. And I said to the captain, "What do they cry?" And he answered, "Pan Omegas Tethneki. Great Pan is dead." And I asked him, "How can God die?" And he answered, "Don't you remember? They crucified him." Then all the people in the ship turned their faces to me and said, "Pontius Pilate. Your name, husband. Your name continually. He suffered under Pontius Pilate."
May the gods avert the omen.
This day is like my dream. This darkness at mid-noon.
I really like that as a dramatization. You can't hear it all in the audio of this production, but in the script, you can see what Pilate's wife hears. It's people saying, "suffered under Pontius Pilate" in language after language. So her dream is billions of people commemorating that what her husband did to Jesus, as they say the Apostles' and Nicene creeds, which is really cool. Unfortunately, we don't really have any idea what the actual dream was. However, notice that in Matthew, she doesn't say that she learned about Jesus for the first time in her dream. She just says, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." One of the things we do know about this period in history is that some Roman women were very interested in Judaism, and Pilate's wife was living right there in Judea, so she may have heard about Jesus like everyone else and formed an opinion about him that he was a righteous man long before she had the dream. Then that night, she had a nightmare about Jesus being persecuted and tried to warn her husband not to take part in it, which some scholars have speculated is what Pilate's trying to do, or rather avoid, when he washes his hands and declares that he's innocent of Jesus' blood, a detail that, like the wife's dream, is only mentioned in Matthew. So maybe Pilate is washing his hands. Maybe washing his hands is Pilate's response to his wife's dream.
Now, let's move to consider the fourth and final incident involving Pilate that Josephus mentions. What happens in this one?
Basically, this one ends Pilate's career as governor. It happens in the year AD 36, and it's important to remember that Samaria, where the Samaritan Israelites live, is part of the territory Pilate governs. You'll also need to know that the Samaritans believed that one should worship on Mount Gerizim in Samaria instead of Mount Zion in Jerusalem. We read about that in John 4, where Jesus is speaking with the woman at the well, and she says,
"Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is a place where people ought to worship."
In fact, the Samaritans had their own temple on Mount Gerizim, though it was destroyed and reduced to ruins by the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus around 110 BC. Nevertheless, there are still several hundred Samaritans today, and every year they go up on Mount Gerizim and sacrifice the Passover lamb, which is something that Jews actually don't do these days. They don't have a sacrificial lamb as part of their Passover meals today because they can't sacrifice them in Jerusalem, because the Muslim Dome of the Rock occupies the Temple Mount. But the Samaritans still go up on their sacred mountain and sacrifice, and we'll have a link to where you can see some video of their Passover celebration. In any event, Josephus tells us that at one point there was a con man who may have also been a false prophet who convinced a bunch of Samaritans that Moses had buried some sacred vessels on Mount Gerizim, even though Moses never entered the Promised Land. And he said that he'd show them the sacred vessels Moses had allegedly buried.
The nation of the Samaritans did not escape without tumults. The man who excited them to it was one who thought lying a thing of little consequence, and who contrived everything so that the multitude might be pleased. So he bade them get together upon Mount Gerizim, which is by them looked upon as the most holy of all mountains, and assured them that when they were come there, he would show them those sacred vessels which were laid under that place, because Moses put them there. So they came there armed, and thought the discourse of the man probable. And as they abode at a certain village, which was called Tirathaba, they got the rest together to them, and desired to go up the mountain in a great multitude together.
So the large group of Samaritans is gathering in the village of Tirathaba, getting ready to go up on Mount Gerizim and see the sacred vessels, and Josephus mentions that they were armed, perhaps for self-protection from bandits, which were a real danger in the day. Here is how Pilate reacts.
But Pilate prevented their going up by seizing upon the roads with a great band of horsemen and footmen, who fell upon those that were gotten together in the village. And when they came to an action, some of them they slew, and others of them they put to flight, and took a great many alive, the principal of whom, and also the most potent of those that fled away, Pilate ordered to be slain.
So even though this group of people wasn't disturbing the peace, Pilate attacks them, perhaps fearing that they would start a religious uprising since they were armed and were going up to their sacred mountain to find sacred vessels. And he also captures a bunch of them, and he executes the most important of the captured, as well as those the important ones of those who ran away. So he must have had to hunt them down. Well, the Samaritans were not happy about this.
But when this tumult was appeased, the Samaritan Senate sent an embassy to Vitellius, a man that had been consul, and who was now president of Syria, and accused Pilate of the murder of those that were killed, for that they did not go to Tirathaba in order to revolt from the Romans, but to escape the violence of Pilate. So Vitellius sent Marcellus, a friend of his, to take care of the affairs of Judea, and ordered Pilate to go to Rome to answer before the emperor to the accusation of the Jews. So Pilate, when he had tarried 10 years in Judea, made haste to Rome, and this in obedience to the orders of Vitellius, which he dared not contradict.
The Samaritans thus appealed to the legate of the nearby and more important province of Syria, who outranked Pilate. Vitellius, the legate, who, by the way, is not the same as the later Emperor Vitellius, it's a different one, then sent a friend of his to be temporary administrator of Judea, and he ordered Pilate to go to Rome because he couldn't judge Pilate himself. Pilate was a Roman citizen, meaning a citizen of the city of Rome, and like St. Paul, he had a legal right to have his case heard by the emperor. Thus, Pilate's 10-year term as governor ended. But before Pilate arrived in Rome, the Emperor Tiberius died. He passed on to his reward on March 16th of AD 37.
Before we continue to talk about our theories and perspectives on Pilate, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Peter H., Lenora G., Chris M., Paul S., and Brian L. Their generous tax-deductible donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Join a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go on pilgrimage to the mysterious shrines and sites of Italy in the Jubilee year 2025 with Jimmy Akin and me, Dom Bettinelli. Go with us on a 12-day, all-inclusive tour that gives you incredible access to Jimmy's insights in Rome, Assisi, Orvieto, Monte Cassino, San Giovanni Rotondo, the Grotto of St. Michael, and more. We're also planning special activities like recording on location for future episodes of Mysterious World and an in-person Weird Questions episode just for pilgrims. Space is limited and filling up, so be sure to find out more. Visit mysterious.fm/Italy 2025 to reserve your spot today. That's mysterious.fm/Italy 2025. So, Jimmy, what theories are there about Pilate that we need to consider?
Well, we've already looked at some of them in the background section, like whether Pilate may have had his position due to Sejanus. But now, from the reason perspective, we'll look at what archaeological evidence we have of him, and we'll look at the question of what happened to him after his governorship. Then, from the faith perspective, we'll consider whether he and his wife should be considered saints.
Then let's look at Pilate from the reason perspective. What archaeological evidence do we have concerning him?
One thing we have is some coins that he minted. He apparently minted coins in the 4th, 5th, and 6th years of his governorship, so between AD 29 and 32. These coins aren't very well made, and they're a denomination known as the pruta. They were made of bronze, and they weren't worth very much. The earliest of these coins commemorate Tiberius's mother, Livia, on one side, and Tiberius himself on the other. After the death of Livia in 29, though, they just honor Tiberius. They do have some pagan symbolism on them. One is the lituus, which was a kind of wand used by Roman augurs, and another is the simpulum, which was a ladle used by Roman priests in making libations to the gods. So it was a symbol of the Roman priesthood. This would have been somewhat offensive to Jews who had to use the money, but Pilate restrained himself and did not put the image of the emperor on the coins, which was done elsewhere in the empire. So he was trying to avoid offending Jewish sensibilities too much. Also, this helps explain the incident where Jesus cleared the money changers from the temple, because secular money, especially money with pagan symbols on it, wasn't fit to use in the temple, so you'd need to change your secular money for money that was pure and suitable to use in God's temple. So that's why the money changers were there.
What else do we know about Pilate from archaeology?
The most famous archaeological thing we have connected with Pilate is what's known as the Pilate stone. It was discovered in 1961 by the Italian archaeologist Maria Teresa Fortuna Canavet, and it contains an inscription referring to Pontius Pilate. Unfortunately, the inscription is damaged, particularly the first and last lines, and one side of the middle two lines is also damaged, which is unfortunate because the damage cuts off what should have been the initial for Pilate's praenomen, like T for Tiberius or M for Marcus. So if the stone hadn't been damaged, we likely would have learned Pilate's praenomen or individual birth name. From what remains in the inscription in the first line, it's conjectured that it contains a reference to the divine Augusti, that is, the deified Emperor Augustus and his wife Livia, who was Tiberius's mother. What's certainly there is the word Tiberium. And then there's what's left of the name Pontius Pilate and what's left of the words prefect of Judea, meaning that Pilate's exact title as governor was prefect, not procurator or something like that. And then the last line has only the letter E surviving, and it's conjectured that this is part of the words fecit dedicavit, or he has dedicated. So the whole inscription is supposed to read something like, to the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated. What we can infer from this is that the stone was originally part of a building called the Tiberium, so there's more honoring of Tiberius for you. Precisely what this building was, we're not sure. It's been suggested that it was a temple to Tiberius, though I'm not sure of that because Tiberius didn't really play up his imperial cult, and he was quite restrictive about where he'd allow people to build temples to him. Ultimately, though, whatever the Tiberium was, it fell into disuse, and the rock was later repurposed as part of a staircase, which is where the archaeologists found it in 1961.
Let's talk about what happened to Pilate after he was recalled to Rome. What do we know about this?
Well, all we can say for sure is that he did not return to his post as governor of Judea, because Josephus gives us a list of the governors that followed, and Pilate's name is not among them. From that, you might infer that his hearing in Rome went badly. Since Tiberius was dead, his case would have been handled by Caligula. But we're actually not certain that there even was a hearing, because it apparently was common for new emperors to cancel legal affairs that dated from their predecessor's reign. So Caligula may have simply canceled the matter, in which case Pilate may have simply gone into retirement as an equestrian. After all, he'd served longer as governor of Judea than any of his predecessors except Gratus. So it was time for him to move on. It's also hypothetically possible he was reassigned to another post in the empire. However, it's also possible that there was a hearing and that it could have gone well for him or that it could have gone badly, in which case Pilate might have been sent into exile somewhere.
Do we know how Pilate died?
Well, right in the early 300s, Eusebius of Caesarea says he committed suicide during the reign of Caligula, which was between 37 and 41. Eusebius writes,
We should not overlook that tradition holds that Pilate himself, of our Savior's time, fell into such misfortunes during the reign of Gaius Caligula, that of necessity he became his own slayer and self-punishing avenger. For as it seems, divine vengeance overtook him in no long while. Those of the Greeks who have written of the Olympiads, together with the events of each period, so relate.
So Eusebius says that he gets this from Greek historians who wrote about the events occurring in each of the Olympiads, which were 4-year periods based on the famed sporting events, and which were used to keep track of history in the Greek world. So you say this happened in the 200th Olympiad, and this happened in year 3 of the 201st Olympiad, and stuff like that. However, there have been scholars who have questioned this. The earlier pagan author Celsus, writing around AD 175, says that nothing bad happened to Pilate, and the Christian author Origen, writing around AD 248, seems to confirm this. Origen writes,
But, Celsus continues, no calamity happened even to him who condemned Jesus, as there did to Pentheus, king of Thebes. madness or deception that is being pulled apart. And yet he does not know that it was not so much Pilate that condemned him, who knew that for envy the Jews had delivered him, as the Jewish nation which has been condemned by God and rent in pieces and dispersed over the whole earth, in a degree far beyond what happened to Pontius. Moreover, why did he intentionally omit what is related of Pilate's wife, who beheld a vision and who was so moved by it as to send a message to her husband, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him."
So Celsus says that nothing bad happened to Pilate, which would rule out suicide, and Origen agrees, but says it wasn't so much Pilate who killed Jesus as the Jewish nation. So they were the ones who got torn apart, like Pontius, king of Thebes, who was torn apart when he tried to spy on the secret rites of Bacchus. Also, it's been noted that Philo published the embassy to Gaius just after Caligula's death in 41. So if Pilate did commit suicide in the reign of Caligula, Philo could easily have put in an aside to the reader saying, "And look at what happened to Pilate for offending Jewish sensibilities. He had to commit suicide, during the course of his reign because God was punishing him." But he didn't say anything like that. So it sounds like somebody's account is wrong. Either Eusebius's Greek historians got it wrong, or Celsus and Origen at least weren't aware of what had happened to Pilate. I thus think it's ambiguous, and we really can't know one way or the other.
What can we say about Pilate from the faith perspective? For example, did he or his wife become a saint?
Well, Pilate's wife, who's referred to as Claudia Procula in later literature, is considered a saint in some Eastern churches, including Eastern Catholic ones, though this was a canonization by popular acclaim rather than by being declared saint by a pope. But her reaction to the dream and her conviction that Jesus was a righteous man, that's a sign in her favor that, she may have made it to heaven. When it comes to Pilate himself, he is considered a saint by the Coptic Orthodox Church and also by the Ethiopian Tewahedo Church. One possible origin for this idea is the North African writer Tertullian. Around the year 197, he wrote,
"All these facts about Christ were reported to Tiberius, the reigning emperor, by Pilate, who was by now a Christian himself, as far as his conscience was concerned."
So Tertullian says that Pilate was a Christian as far as his conscience was concerned. However, I don't know that that means Pilate was actually a Christian. Otherwise, why add the clause as far as his conscience was concerned? That could just be an extrapolation from the fact that Pilate didn't view Jesus as guilty of the crimes of which he was being accused, as the Gospels say. So Tertullian may have just been inferring that Pilate had a positive attitude towards Jesus from the Gospels. He didn't want to crucify him, meaning he was like the Christians in his conscience. And he wasn't actually saying that Pilate was a literal Christian. However, over the centuries, there came to be a huge number of writings about Pilate in Christian circles. They're sometimes called the Pilate cycle, but they totally contradict each other, with some portraying Pilate as an unrepentant villain to the end and others portraying him as a saint and a martyr. So I don't think we can know anything conclusive from those writings.
Is there anything else we ought to know about Pilate from the early church fathers?
There is one thing, and it also comes from Tertullian. You'll note that in the passage we just heard, he says Pilate made a report to the Emperor Tiberius about Jesus. Earlier in the same work, he says,
"Tiberius, in whose reign the name of Christian entered the world, hearing from Palestine and Syria information which had revealed the truth of Christ's divinity, brought the matter before the Senate, with previous indication of his own approval. The senators, on the ground that they had not verified the facts, rejected it. Caesar maintained his opinion and threatened dire measures against those who brought accusations against the Christians. Consult your histories. You will find in them that Nero, was the first to rage with the imperial sword against this religion, which was just at that particular time coming to life at Rome.
So connecting those two things, Tertullian thinks Pilate reported about Jesus to Tiberius, and then Tiberius brought the matter of Jesus' divinity to the Roman Senate's attention to see about having him declared a god. But the Senate rejected this proposal, though Tiberius was still favorable towards Jesus and threatened anybody who would make accusations against Christians.
What do you make of this account?
I'm quite skeptical of it, and historians don't think it's accurate. In the first place, I think it's unlikely that Pilate made a report to Tiberius about Jesus. Pilate executed lots of people. We know that he executed at least 3 men during the Passover of AD 33, those being Christ and the 2 revolutionaries that he was crucified between. Well, Pilate certainly didn't write to the emperor about each person he executed, and I think it very doubtful that Pilate would recommend Jesus to the emperor as a god, or that the emperor would conclude that Jesus was likely a god based on a letter he got from one of his governors who he had previously rebuked. So I think that the story is very unlikely. Though it is true that Nero was the first emperor to treat Christians harshly, and he did that only after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, which Nero had blamed on Christians as scapegoats. We have evidence that before that Nero had tried St. Paul and had let him go, though Paul would later be beheaded by some of Nero's governors in Rome, which happened after the Great Fire.
Let's bring things to a close by looking at Pontius Pilate in connection with apologetics. Today, some skeptics argue that the 4 evangelists whitewash Pilate in the Gospels, that they make him look innocent and the Jewish leaders as the bad guys. They sometimes say that from everything we know about Pilate, he was a thoroughly bad guy. And so it was really him who wanted Jesus dead because he thought he was a political revolutionary, and that all the stuff about him being reluctant to kill Jesus is made up to make the Romans look good. What do you think of that?
I think it fundamentally misreads the facts. It's just an exaggeration to say that Pilate was nothing but cruel and didn't care about his subjects' views at all. The only author who is purely negative toward him is Philo, and he's as negative as he is because he wants to contrast Pilate's behavior with that of Tiberius, who he wants Caligula to emulate. He wants him to do what Tiberius did, not what Pilate did. So Philo exaggerates how bad Pilate was and how good Tiberius was. When we turn to Josephus, he provides examples that aren't as negative. For example, in the incident regarding the aqueduct, he says Pilate paid for it using money from the temple treasury, but notice what Pilate's doing. He's building an aqueduct to get Jerusalem more water. That's the act of a good governor who is providing for his subjects, making sure they have an adequate water supply, which when they didn't previously. Josephus also indicates that unlike his predecessor, Pilate kept the same high priest for his entire term. That's a sign he had at least a decent functional relationship with the Jewish authorities. And the coins that Pilate minted deliberately did not have the emperor's image, which is a sign of deference to Jewish sensibilities. And then there's the fact that Pilate lasted as governor for 10 years, which is more than 3 times as long as most of his predecessors. And you don't last that long unless you're doing something right. Also, in those 10 years, Josephus and Philo have only 5 incidents that they report about him, which is 1 incident every 2 years. And that's not bad for a Roman governor of a hostile province. Finally, the incident of the standards from right at the beginning of Pilate's tenure shows that he could bend to Jewish sensibilities, as he did when the embassy threw themselves on the ground and bared their necks, which convinced him to pull the standards with the emperor's image out of Jerusalem. That gives us a complex portrait of a man who, while not a fan of his subjects, was able to work out a basically functional relationship with them for 10 years and keep the peace. So when the Jewish leaders bring Jesus before Pilate and pressure him to use capital punishment, I can see him bending to their will, regardless of his personal opinion. He needs to keep peace with his subjects. This is Passover. Religious tensions are high at this time of year, especially. And the leaders of his subjects, including the high priest he's worked with for 10 years, are telling him that he needs to put Jesus to death. They even threaten him. In John 19:12, they tell him, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to us today, but at the time, friend of Caesar was a coveted title in this period that only certain people had. I mean, Caesar would designate you his friend, and then that was your title. And this may indicate that Pilate had that title, and now they're using it against him. But whether he officially had the title or not, either way, they're threatening to report Pilate to Caesar if he lets Jesus go and say, hey, we've got this revolutionary here, and your governor Pilate, he's not taking care of it. So in light of all this, I can easily see Pilate making a compromise between his own inclinations and what his Jewish subjects were demanding, just as he did on the occasion of the standards. The idea that Jews had zero influence with Pilate is just not what we find in the historical record. Instead, the sources we have reveal him as a somewhat stubborn man who was nevertheless willing to compromise with his subjects to get things done, and he was successful at that for 10 years, much longer than most governors.
And Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
Pontius Pilate is a mysterious man. We don't know much about his time before he was governor. During his governorship, he was a complex individual. He could be stubborn, but he could also compromise, and he was basically successful for 10 years. We also don't know anything about what happened to him after he left office. There are some interesting stories about him, but we don't know which are true, and I'm suspicious of ones that would paint him as a convert or martyr to the Christian faith.
Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to viewers and listeners?
We'll have a link to Whiston's translation of the works of Josephus. Also, we'll have a link to Philo's Embassy to Gaius, Cassius Dio's Roman History, at least the volume that covers Pilate. Also, Jack Finnegan's Handbook of Biblical Chronology and Andrew Steinman's Chronology from Abraham to Paul, both of which cover Herod the Great's reign and when it really occurred, when it began and ended. We'll have general information about Pontius Pilate and Sejanus, an article that I wrote a number of years ago about the Herod family, Dorothy Sayer, a video playlist of Dorothy Sayer's radio plays, The Man Born to be King, video of the Samaritan Passover celebration, audio and video of the Catholic talk show.
Very good. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the mystery of Pontius Pilate? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515. I also want to thank Mike Creevy and Isabella Bettinelli for their voiceover work in this episode.
And special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Do go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com, and check out the video version of Mysterious World as well as all my other videos. While you're there, please like, comment, and share the video, and also subscribe and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Well, we're coming up on Halloween, so next week we're going to be doing a Halloween special featuring Halloween-themed weird questions. We'll be talking about things like, does Halloween come from the pagan Celtic festival Samhain? What are my favorite Halloween candies and costume? Will you get excommunicated if you dress up as a Knight Templar for Halloween? What to make of a listener's strange experience that happened during Halloween week? Who's the best Dracula? Whether the Addams Family or the Munsters is better? Is the Annabelle doll possessed by a demon? What's the difference between exorcism and deliverance? And more.
All right. So stick around for that next week, folks. That's going to be a good one. Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast from. That helps us grow our community and reach even more listeners. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/334. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Ferguson Electric and Automation, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida at aaronv.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.